Right, just before we crack on with this episode, just a quick word about our sponsor, KS Civils and Groundworks Limited, based in Leeds. They have over 296 years of combined experience in civil engineering and groundworks. Led by Director Carl Smith, their team is known for honesty, reliability and commitment to the highest safety and quality standards. They're proudly ISO accredited and fully CHAS Elite accredited. No matter the size of your project, KS Civils and Groundworks delivers professional, trustworthy service you can rely on. To learn more, visit kscivilsandgroundworks.co.uk. Now let's dive back into this episode. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. Tonight I've got the honour of Marcus Peters on the podcast. So Marcus was in the Royal Navy as an ex-submariner. He joined the Navy in the mid-80s. Sorry, put my teeth back in there. Start again. Hi Marcus, how are you doing? Welcome to the podcast.
I'm really good. Sat in a hotel room in Milton Keynes, so living the life, yeah.
God, Milton Keynes. Is that the concrete cows and all that around there, isn't it?
Concrete cows and lots of roundabouts. You know?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for coming on the podcast and agreeing to do this. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Right, so it's the same question I'm going to ask you that I ask everybody else. And everyone's heard me mention these so many times at the beginning of every podcast. So it's, where did you grow up? Why did you join? What was it like? Why did you leave? And what have you done since? So if we can just start off with a bit of background about yourself, like where you grew up and what made you actually join the military.
Yeah, I grew up, as you can probably tell from my my twang, I grew up in the Black Country, which isn't Birmingham for the Brummies who are listening. And I grew up in a place called Netherton, which is the only thing it's famous for was nail making, chain making, and it made the Titanic anchor, which, considering it's sort of nowhere near the ocean, was pretty interesting. But if you go there now, it's a pretty run-down little town in the Black Country that has a massive replica of the Titanic anchor in the middle of the thing. And it was interesting, you know. Dad worked in a factory and Mum worked for the council. I'd had an uncle who was, and you'd like him because he was Royal Artillery in the war. And you know, I used to sit on his knee and listen to some stories from him. My granddad had passed away before I was born, so I never really got a chance to talk to him. And my other granddad lived in Australia, so definitely didn't get to speak to him. So he was pretty influential. It was sort of, the Black Country in the 70s was, you know, it was gritty, it was full of character, but completely shaped by industry. You know, I always remember not having an alarm clock because, you know, the stamping works would start at 6 a.m. and the bed would move and you knew that was time to get up, sort of. But there was a lot of close-knit communities, really hard-working families, but you know, humour and resilience that just came from these generations of people that, you know, whatever life sort of threw at them, it sort of, you know, they were there and just got through it. And when you look at the landscape that I remember growing up as a kid, you know, it was foundries and chimneys and canal works, and just, you know, at night you'd be walking around and there'd be like the orange glow of the furnaces and stuff, and you could just smell like oil and coal and smoke. And but the people were sort of ingrained with this sort of a very interesting sort of culture, because they were really stuck between two moments in time. You know, they had been the heart of the Industrial Revolution for a couple of hundred years and gone through both world wars and massively contributed. You know, and I look at my nan, for example, you know, my mom's mom, you know, she'd been sort of a assistant cook in a large house in Birmingham, left school at 14, and then the war comes, she ends up sort of making Spitfires during the war. You know, I mean, you can't really understand, you know, what the Black Country was like during that period. And obviously it was bombed to pieces as well at times. But they were then hit this moment in the 70s where you had traditional manufacturing declining, and, you know, the UK economy was really bad, and the whole identity of the region was built around steelworks and engineering workshops and chain making and factory life. And, you know, you always knew, you know, the kids growing up, you had somebody who worked shifts. Didn't know anybody who was in the military. Nobody had a dad that was in the military, which was really interesting. They came home in overalls, and it was hard physical work. And I just think that was quite an interesting sort of perspective when I look back, because at no point during that period did I ever think about joining the military, other than Christmas I'd see my uncle and he'd tell me stories about being in Egypt and El Alamein, and he was part of the Desert Rats 8th Army with the artillery going through that. And then when I was about 10, we had a new neighbour move next door, and he was an ex-Royal Marine Commando. He'd done about 5 years. He did the end of 43 onwards to Korea in the Marines, and then left. So he'd been sort of kept on as a full-time Marine after World War II, wasn't demobbed, stayed in. And then he became a police officer, and he was old school police, He'd done his full time, and he moved next door, and he was a massive, imposing figure to me. He was, a giant. But he'd left for the police, bought this house next door to us, and his job that he got for sort of semi-retirement, he was the groundskeeper at Walsall Football Club, and all he would do is literally sit on the mower, and that was his, chill after 40 odd years. He sat on a mower. And he just started talking about the Marines and the Navy and big grey ships and engineering and all that. And I sort of got into, and he started getting into, I don't know if you're ever into Airfix models and all that sort of stuff. I enjoyed the putting things together, and then
models.
And working on your bike and making rat rods and making just stuff that we couldn't afford anything.
Yeah.
So you go over the tip and you pull bits and pieces out and make a bike out of broken up bikes that were rusty and clean them up. And I just like stuff in my hands. So I was very interested in engineering. And, I think that was what triggered the spark. And then 82 came, and I was 13, and I'm sat with my next door neighbour watching the fleet go out and watching the fleet come back from the Falklands. And it just stirred something in me. My nan was always very patriotic. The Queen, she was revered in you go to my nan's house and there'd be royal sort of tea towels everywhere, and she'd have a plate and stamps and anything that got the royal family on it, she bought it, sort of thing. But it just sparked this thing in me. And I think the problem was, because Black Country was declining so much, your opportunities were trickling away, because I knew from about the age of 13, 14 that I was bright enough to go to university, but there was absolutely no way that I was ever going to go to university, because people like me never went to university.
Yeah.
I was a kid from a council house.
It was very different in them days, wasn't it?
Totally.
Yeah.
And I got in, I was about, 14, 15. And you had to go, might have been the same, but you had to go and see the school careers officer.
Yeah.
And they were always women. It was never a male job. It was, it was like reverse sexism in some respects. And I just didn't want to go, because I thought, what's the point? And I'd been working my dad's factory in the school holidays. He got to a sort of supervisory level at that point. And they made this old school factory making steel lockers. And it was all hand presses. So you take a square piece of steel and literally cut the corners out of the steel to make it bend and fold. And it was all done by hand. There was no automation. Equipment from 1850s, and there was a guy there who'd lost 3 fingers, Tony, on the guillotine, and his introduction to health and safety was, "Yo, put your fingers in there, son, because you won't get them back." And and that was the sort of people you're dealing with. But I ended up getting dragged out of class by the deputy head, and I got took to this woman, and she literally sat me down and put 3 factory jobs in front of me. And I've got absolutely no problem with anybody working in a factory. I mean, manufacturing is, is a fantastic thing, and everything that we touch is manufactured. I just knew it wasn't me, and I also knew that if I went into a factory, that ultimately I would still be there when I was, 60s, and I'd probably die in the factory. It feels very egotistical, and I am not egotistical, but I just felt I was destined for more, that there was a bigger world out there. And these stories that I'd heard from the next door neighbour and from my uncle, and this sense of patriotism from my nan, and then seeing the images of the fleet coming back, I just thought, well, I'll go and have a look. And I literally got on the bus and went up to Wolverhampton and went into the careers office and went, what can I do? I'm due to leave school, and what could I do? And the RAF were on lunch, surprise, surprise. The army were like, oh, Germany's great. Yeah, there's tanks and living in a ditch. And I was like, that seems a bit hard work. And then the Navy were like, oh, come to see us, and look at this, you can work on all this equipment. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then they said, yeah, we're basically recruiting chefs. That's not for me. Brokers, I thought, well, that's in the bottom of the ship. If it all goes pear-shaped, that's you're last out, so that doesn't sound good. And they said, oh, you can be a weapons engineering tech. I said, oh, what's that? They said, well...
Sounds a bit better, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds a bit better. I said, what do they do? They said, anything that goes bang, they work on it, fix it, shoot it. I thought, oh. And it was literally everything from small arms and, SLRs and SMGs and all that fun stuff before we transitioned to SA-80s. But then it was also the missile systems and torpedoes and everything in between. And I just thought, yeah, it's my ticket out of here. And I live back on the fringe of the Black Country now. My wife says that I was born in Mordor because Tolkien always used Mordor as Black Country, and we live in the Shire because we live on the Shropshire border, and we're like literally 7 or 8 miles away, but it feels
so
hugely,
different, yeah,
so different. But there is something, as I get older, I reminisce and go, there was something magical about that rough upbringing, and I think where it does connect to the military is the sense of transition between that old industrial Britain and the modern world that was emerging, and and the people would be made unemployment, and there was a resilience within the communities there. And I think it wasn't polished in any way or romanticized. It was just real hard graft with real proud people. And I remember going into pubs and it was loud and smoky and funny, and Staffordshire Bull Terriers everywhere because they come from the Black Country. Everybody had a Staffy and was proud of it, sort of thing. And I ended up having a Staffy, so that's another story. But yeah, it was just, I don't know, people knew the value of work and family and community, and in some respects, I think even where I live, even though it's slightly prettier than when I grew up, it's it doesn't feel as connected to community. And obviously,
I think that's modern society, to be honest now.
Yeah, it is. And I think, but when you joined up, I remember suddenly thinking I found my tribe, and you'll be the same. And even now, when I'm amongst veterans, it's my tribe because there's a connection. You can't explain it, whether that's, a young person or, serving at the moment who I sometimes help, or people older than me, and a lot of the people that I served with, they're certainly in the senior NCOs, they are, kicking on now, and some of them, unfortunately, are no longer with us, but it's still your tribe, isn't it? You know what I mean? So,
I know what you mean about, the late 70s, early 80s. I mean, around my way, I grew up in Article, which was just unemployment. There was no there. Nearly everything had closed down by the beginning of the 80s. We used to have shipbuilding, coal, everything, just growing up, but there was nothing. The military was a way out for a lot of people. The majority of my year at school didn't take it. There was a good few of us, but I had 2 brothers in the army. And
Mm.
so I think it was kind of expected for me to join anyway. And you know about the careers office or the careers office teacher type thing, where it is, they've called me and they says, right, what do I wasn't the best behaved at school, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So they didn't have much faith in what I was going to do, and they was like, you've got to pick what you're going to. It's too late. I've already signed me on for the Legions. I was in the army before I did my exams. I'd already signed up. I'd got me £5 out of the careers office.
Yeah.
I did my last exam, and then a couple of days later, I was down to junior leaders.
Yeah.
Your neck of the woods, your neck of the woods, Nuneaton.
Yeah.
But you're right. The world was changing, or the country was changing very much so around that period. The power way, all the mines were starting to close or get closed down. Employment was rife. You couldn't explain to kids nowadays. I say kids nowadays, not even kids, like 30-year-olds, what it was like then. It was a very, very different world. Very, very different.
It was very different. And I think, looking back now with hindsight, there was this huge transition from what had been a very prosperous country and empire, historically. And the big manufacturing powerhouses were Birmingham and the Black Country. And then all that manufacturing had gone, and we had the strikes and the 3-day week. And, I remember sitting, I was telling my kids this the other week, we were talking about power cuts. And I said, I remember sitting doing homework with a candle because there was no power. There was constant power cuts, wasn't there? There was like a year or 2 years growing up where there was just power cuts all the time. And it's like kids nowadays, when was the last time they had a power cut unless, it was electrical storm or something? It's quite interesting. But there was that transitional period of, things being exported to we import everything and we don't manufacture anything ourselves. And for those areas, and the same, on Tyneside and that side, where the shipbuilding, and you look at Glasgow with the shipbuilding, how that just decimated for years. So it was difficult, particularly if you knew there was something in you. I mean, my wife always says, my son's a bit like me. There's a bit of wanderlust, hence why, my son's in the Marines currently. But he was never going to do a desk job. There was always something in there.
So what was it like turning up for training then? I mean, like you said, you've had the only thing you've come across in the military was your uncle who was in the artillery.
Yeah.
That doesn't prepare you for the Royal Navy, not in the slightest. And I've had guys from the Navy on before, and I've talked to them about like basic training, and it's not too dissimilar to the armies, really.
I mean back
shows
then,
on telly and stuff, and whatever.
There was a show as I joined up. It was on just afterwards, called Nozzers, because they used to call. It was one of these naval phrases. I mean, there's loads of naval phrases, in society anyway. But because like young baby recruits were always in trouble, and they go, "No, sir," but it sounded like Nozzer, and the program was called Nozzers, and it was just about like HMS Raleigh and welcome to the Royal Navy, because it didn't matter what your trade was. It's a bit like, with the infantry, isn't it? They all go to infantry school and then they go off to the regiments afterwards, sort of thing. So yeah, I just remember suddenly it was like a rabbit in the headlights at times, when, getting off the train in Plymouth, and we got on this big bus and they took you down past Union Street, which at the time was, I think, the largest red light district in the UK. And you could see all the ladies in the night out there, and this chief at the front of the bus said, take a good look. That's the last women you'll see for months. Because we were segregated, Jenny Wrens, as we used to call them, were separated from the male recruits. And, you could sort of fraternise slightly at about, 8 weeks into the training, sort of thing. But I joined up, and I wanted to join up, and it was interesting that there was a few people who got in and went, I remember one lad, it got to the attestation and he was like, no, I can't do this. He went before he even signed. he'd gone. He'd gone to all the trouble of getting down there, and I think they put him up in a transit accommodation for the night, and then he got the train back. But we had this petty officer, sort of NCO, called Larry Lloyd, who was just as mad as a box of frogs. That didn't help. Smokes like a trooper. Even when we used to we got beasted, like, right, everybody quadrangle, going on a 10-mile run sort of thing. And we used to have, all the dockyards used to have bicycles to get from one end of the dockyard to the other. So the Navy had loads of bikes everywhere. And I remember him riding a dockyard bike with a cigarette in his mouth while we're doing a squad run. I'm going, what's this all about? And he was just a character, full-size character that I don't think you probably get anymore. And you probably remember characters like that. But I found it really interesting because, there was a lot of engineering type activities that I could see a path to what I wanted to do. And that engineering really appealed to me, and I got a sort of a technical mindset. So I got on with a lot of it, and I liked the logical aspects and the discipline, and all those sort of things were really good. There were some bits where I go, what am I doing here? I mean, we did like a week of like ropes and knots and all this sort of stuff, which for the Seamen's branch, who do all the rope stuff, and that goes right back to Nelson's and before, they were still doing the same knots that were, probably on the on the Mary Rose sort of thing. But you had this like exam where you walked into a room and there was a horizontal piece of rope, and there was all these little bits of rope hanging off it, and they go, right, do a half sheep shank, blah blah blah, and you do, and they go, yes, correct, and like, I couldn't do that if I tried now, and when I got to the fleet, I just remember this like PO going, I don't need any of that crap. Just do a Stoker's Dobie hitch. I said, what's that? He went, bah, nothing's getting past that. And it was just a big, massive knot. He just kept tying things until it was a knot. And, but there were some things you go, what am I doing this for again? But you just crack on, don't you? And I think that, I was talking to a young guy who's just left the Navy, and I'm helping at the moment. And, just the things like the smoking culture. Back then, we got issued, you signed up to be a smoker, and the Royal Navy would sell you 600 cigarettes for, I think it was something like £2 per 200. And there was a black market as well, because all the non-smokers registered as smokers, drew the cigarettes, and then sold them back to the smokers. And the packet, they're called blue liners. I don't know if you ever saw them, but
no,
it was a packet of cigarettes. It said Royal Navy on. You took them out. It was like a capstan full strength, and it had a blue line down it, and it said something like no duty paid. So you couldn't, technically, you weren't supposed to like go to a nightclub with them, but all the lads did, because under the UV light, you looked pretty cool because your cigarette had the blue line down. It was weird, really weird.
Thinking back to that, how weird is it that you smoke in a pub?
Yeah, I know.
You wouldn't imagine it now, would you?
No. Well, I think the thing that I just remember, like bulling your parade boots, if in doubt, sit down and clean your boots. That's the motto of all three services, isn't it? And but you couldn't smoke in like the accommodation block. You could only smoke in the corridor. And all along the corridor were these big metal ashtrays. I used to call them fannies, these big metal sort of tins, and they must have been, 14, 18 inches sort of diameter, just full of cigarettes. So everybody would just go and get the gear, sit down, and there'd be 30-odd, 40-odd guys sat in a corridor, bulling the boots, and just passing the cigarettes, right, having the crack. Nowadays, like I talk to my lad, and there's not, not a lot, because of single man accommodation and stuff. There's not a lot of interaction and crap. And those are some of the best days I had in the military, where sitting with a bunch of guys doing a pointless task, but having the crack and just, enjoying
I
life.
mean, the amount of times stuff like that, I mean, even leading back when I first joined, when I got to Germany, and I got introduced to corridor parties. I didn't know what that was. And everyone used to bring the beds out of the rooms and bring the quilt out and in the corridor. All the beer you could get. We'd break in a cookhouse, get some food.
Yeah.
Many times we've been trying to make an omelette out of 3 million eggs and a massive block of cheese.
That's it.
But some great nights like that, and it brings people together as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I say about the people now, I've spoken to guys who are serving now, and they finish work, go to the room, don't see anybody till the next day. That's.
I know. I find it.
Right.
I think. I mean, I know my son. The social activity is a bit like it is normally. The pub that we knew, which was the social gathering, is now the gym. You go to a JD Pure Gym or wherever it is, and certainly the Marines, that's their hangout after work. Is they do fizz, so they're in the gym and they're seeing each other. And because the gym is, there's no rank structure to the gym. It's not like the corporal's mess or anything. You've got everybody in there, so that's for them. And they are a smaller unit anyway. They're a close knit community in the Marines, because it's one of the smaller branches. But I think that those nights of just sitting down doing pointless tasks and meeting guys and that was brilliant. I think the downside of that was, and this happened all the way through my naval career, and I think a lot of matlows do suffer with this, is that you go through your basic training with all these great people, and then you got thrown to the wind because the chefs went to one training establishment, the weapons engineers went to another one, the stokers went to another one, the air technicians went to another one, and you probably don't even see those guys ever again.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a guy, a good friend of mine who, we were together and he was in my troop. And basically, he went off and became a stoker and ended up on the Royal Yacht for 8 years, and lives up in Doncaster. And we've never seen each other since the day we left basic training. We correspond on Facebook and, watch each other's lives from that perspective. But, there's only about 4 or 5 of us from that basic troop that we ever really stay connected with. And then you go to your trade training, part 2 and part 3 training. I went, from Plymouth to Collingwood, near Fareham, where all the WEs went, and still there, big base, a lot of history. And that's when you
I know Collingwood and all them. I used to live in Gosport.
Yeah, there you go. So you suddenly rock up at Collingwood, and now all the kit is really big, and it's stuff from the fleet, and you're working on everything, from anti-aircraft guns to missile systems, and you're learning your trade. But then halfway through the trade training, you split, and you either went electronic, or you went mechanical, electrical, and you had to do a couple of test pieces. And I remember they called me in and said, "You're going mechanical, electrical." I said, "Oh, thank you very much." And that was what I wanted anyway. And but their reasoning was the soldering that I'd done on my electronic test piece was the same as my welding, so they thought that it'd be better if I went that route. So yeah, and I put in for frigates in Plymouth. Was uber excited about it. Got to Plymouth, and within 10 days, I got drafted to HMS Dolphin, which I didn't know what the hell that was. And I remember the Master at Arms saying, "Oh, congratulations, you're going to become a Sun Dodger." I was like, "I don't get it." "Oh, you will." And then I rocked up in Gosport, and yeah, it was suddenly like, okay, you're going to the silent service, and that was very interesting as well. I mean,
so
Dolphin
it wasn't choice then, huh?
No. And what would happen is you could either volunteer or you could get drafted. And I know guys, I've got a good friend of mine who he got drafted as like a chief. He'd been on surface fleet for, he's an artificer, but he'd been probably 12 years in the Navy and then got drafted to boats. And he had to do, I think it was either 4 or 5 years, and then you could, you've done your time, you could basically go. But the problem was you got extra money.
Yes.
So it was quite a considerable amount. It was, a good chunk. It was like 10, 11 pounds a day or something back then.
So I was, the reason I lived in Gosport is that I was posted to Thorney Island, the 4-7 regiment.
Yeah.
The Murray quarters, somewhere on the island, and somewhere in Gosport.
Was it Rowner?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. Yeah.
Enough said.
I can't believe they've sold most of them, and people live in them.
I know.
Our first flat was terrible. But I mean, that just reminded me of some of that. The people who lived the flat underneath us was like a temporary flat for lads when they come back on the shop that they could bring their girlfriends down and stuff like that. I thought this had never happened in the army. I've never seen anything like that. But we used to get annoyed with the guy who'd go out on a piss down in the Gosport, and you'd bump into the lads who were doing training, but they've got the dolphins on, and they were telling us how much they were getting paid, and we were like, that's not right. That's not.
Oh, I mean,
it was ridiculous compared to what we were earning.
I was like, I think equivalent of an able seaman. I was never an able seaman because that was not our rank structure, but it was the equivalent of an able seaman. And I was earning more as an able seaman submariner than a leading hand surface fleet, which is like Lance Jack Corporal sort of level. And that was the problem, because what people said to the guys that got drafted, they said, what you want to do is try and get out of it, but you can't really get out of it. I knew one guy that he actually volunteered. His name was Middy Middleton, and he had really bad acne. And acne was, complete face of craters, because he was a young lad. And they went, no, because you can't wash on submarines, you can't go for medical reasons. I was like, so everybody was like trying to get spots and things to get out of it, but just rubbing lard on your face or whatever. But yeah, basically you couldn't get out of it. So they said, oh, well, what you do, go to your boat when you get drafted and just put that money away. Well, it wasn't like having a Monzo account at the, now where you can digitally put money away into pots and things. It wasn't that. Nobody did. Of course, you just pissed it up against the wall anyway.
Yeah.
So it was very, very, strange. And I remember going on like my first sort of submarine was, it was a glorified U-boat. First time going down the boat, it was like, it's single deck. It was just mad, literally you could stand at one end of the boat and look down the other. You had hot bunking, so people were obviously, when they were awake, you were asleep, and vice versa. But they had hammocks between the torpedo tubes and stuff. And the torpedo tube didn't actually have a torpedo in it. What they would do is open the torpedo and put bin liners full of clothes in there. And then when you went to Hamburg on a run ashore, they got all the bin liners out, and then you put them on. You all smelt of diesel, so they'd have like a bottle of Brute that go round. So you all smelt the same, of this like Brute diesel hybrid smell. That apparently was quite attractive, or that's what you thought.
Yeah. Attractive to who?
Yeah, exactly. But we were just like dirty, horrible pirates, and like the surface fleet didn't like us because it was like, oh, submariners are in, And it's interesting. I was talking. Oh, we digress slightly, but I was volunteering for the British Legion, and this guy turned up, and he was ex-boat squadron down at Poole, and there was me. I was standing there selling poppies, and he was an old boy, 20 years younger than me. He was really a good guy, but there was a para, there was Royal Engineers, there was a Mercian regiment, somebody else, and he went, I fought you, I fought you. I fought you. Fought you. And he looked at me and my dolphins. He went, never fight you guys. And I said, what do you mean? He said, submariners are just dirty, horrible people. He said, you fight in packs. He said, it's just, you don't fight on your own. You fight like packs. You're like jackals. It was like, you know what I mean? But it was, yeah, we were just a bit different and dirty and didn't wash and beards and, you know.
I suppose living in such a confined space, you will become like a pack. You will,
Yeah.
gel really well.
Oh, totally.
Going back to your training for the submarine,
Yeah.
basically. So I mean, you've got your trade training, then you've got to go and do your submariner training. I don't really know much about that, but I've heard like there's a bit where you stand in the bottom of a coaling tower and they fill it full of water and you float the top or something.
Yeah, so basically they've stopped it now for, ironically, health and safety reasons. And I think it was a bit of glorified PR, because I think somebody will probably correct me on this when this goes out, but from memory, the largest ascent that they ever did from a submarine was about 850 feet. Well, you're pretty shallow if you're at 850 feet. You go off the continental shelf, you're in thousands of feet of water. So, yeah, it was a bit of a PR, but what you would do, and the tower's there, if you're in Gosport, you can see the tower at Dolphin, although Dolphin isn't a naval base anymore. Ironically, the Army were using it for a period of time. But you would go in and you had to do a 9 metre, an 18 metre, and a 30 metre ascent. And what you would do is the 9 metre, they would put you in a chamber, they would flood it. And if you're a hobbit like me, the base of the water came up and then you started to float to the top. And then they would go, take a good deep breath, and they plunge you under. And you go through a hole in the side of the compartment, and a dive, you're just blobbing away, and the diver would grab you, and then you had to breathe to the surface, because obviously air expands, Boyle's law and all that. So you have to blow out all the way to the surface, and then you hit the surface, you get out, stand on a line, and they watch you to make sure you've not got the bends. So you do the 9 metre, I think, a couple of times, then you do the 18 metre, and then the 30 metre is a mock-up of a submarine escape tower. So you actually go inside like the Smarty tube, and they shut the bottom lid behind you, and then they flood it. So it's just like a single torpedo tube. You're inside it, and when the pressure equalizes, a hatch opened, you shot out. But again, a dive, you're in a suit, and you have to breathe normally. So it's got like a hood, and the air fills the hood. So you're not actually, your face isn't wet. And then as you go, you're like a human torpedo, because it's got little stell valves in the suit. So as the air expands, it's like a jet propulsion system. It fires you up to the surface. And you wear like a nappy, because if you pee yourself and it gets cold, you get kidney failure and all that sort of stuff. So there's all these little things you have to wear to do it. But a diver would always grab you. And clearly, if you were doing it for real, there wouldn't be a diver. But the diver would grab you, and he'd go, name, rank, and number. And you go, blah, 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 and boom, let you go. And like about 10 seconds later, you'd pop at the top. And you literally cleared, slammed down. And you're in this big, like, noddy suit. And they drag you out. And you might stumble. They go, oh, all the medics are on you, So it was a proper adrenaline rush. And they call it SET, Submarine Escape Training and Tower. And it was, really interesting. And there was a team based down there. And I used to know a guy who was in charge of it. And they were the submarine parachute group. Because what they would do if a sub goes down and the marker buoy goes off, they would mobilize, get on a Herc, fly out, and like be parachuted to where the submarine's gone down to start putting like echo sounders in the water, waiting for obviously the cavalry to arrive. But yeah, it was interesting and again quite technical. Every time you're watching valves and pipe work, and I thought this is just great. I mean, how many kids ever get to do this sort of thing? It was fun, And the training was interesting. I think what then was the stark realization, and this isn't the same when you get to the surface fleet. You got to the submarine, and it did not matter who you were, what rank you were, what trade you were. You had to do what they call a Part 3 assessment, because you were a risk. You didn't know the submarine. And the thing is, in the submarine community is, if something goes wrong, you deal with it, because there is no cavalry to come. You've got limited numbers of people. I mean, you're talking 80 people on a diesel sub. You're only talking about 120, 130 on one of the bigger boats. So there's not many people. And obviously, when everything goes wrong, it always goes spectacularly wrong. So you're expected to deal with everything and anything. And the Part 3 training would be basically this: you get a book, and it would have all the different systems and processes in there. So you would start forward to aft, learning the hydraulic system, the pneumatic system, the nuclear reactor, the diesel engines, the firefighting equipment, the emergency breathing systems, where they're stored. And you had to go and do, after every single one of these systems, you'd go and do a board. And you'd sit in front of, a chief or a warrant officer or whoever it might be, and they would know their systems inside out, back to front, and you would answer quick-fire questions for about an hour. And if you passed it, they'd sign it. And then when you got all the signatures, you then went and sat in front of your final board, which was, normally the first lieutenant, an engineering officer, and a couple of senior rates. And you had an hour and a half of quick-fire questions. And if you passed all of that, then you were a submariner. And then you would wait until you'd all passed, or the new entrants had passed. And they normally did it, you did it while you were on patrol. So you were classed a bit like in oil and gas, where you're classed as a newbie, green hat type thing. And then they call your name up, there'd be a presentation of the captain, and you would get like 4 fingers of rum in a pewter tankard or a shot glass, and your dolphins were sat inside. And I remember the coxswain saying, you haven't had spirits, don't fucking throw up. Because what you got to do is neck it and catch the dolphins in your teeth. That was the sort of the tradition. And I just remember this black, Kraken style rum, but it's gunpowder proof. Navy rum is gunpowder proof, which I don't know if you know. Proper Navy rum is gunpowder proof, which is the first ever quality control. Do you know that?
No.
Yeah. So gunpowder rum has to be, I think it's 57% proof. And the reason they call it gunpowder was because what was happening is they would, obviously the Navy would buy rum from the West Indies, and people would nick the rum in transit and top it up with water. And what the Navy then did was took what they thought was rum, added it to water to make grog, because they couldn't keep fresh water fresh. So when they were on the sailing ships, they needed the rum. So the reason sailors are good at drinking is because sailors were half pissed all the time, right? Because they're drinking grog. That's what they drink. But if you've got watered down rum and then you add water to it, it's no longer even grog. It's just watered down shit.
Yeah.
So they worked out that they would take samples before they accepted the thing. And if you put a quarter rum and a quarter gunpowder and light it and it goes bang, has to be at least 57%. If there's water in the rum, it won't go bang. So yeah, so if you ever go to like Naval Dockyard and ask for some rum, the proper Navy rum is 57%. There is rum that's lower than that. But I just remember getting my dolphins and not only being proud, because they are the only medals other than my patrol pin. We didn't get medals because we weren't supposed to talk about where we went. We didn't. It was the middle of the Cold War and the IRA and all of that, so we didn't talk about it. You didn't wear uniform, and you're probably the same. And you would whisper in a pub if you met somebody and said, "Oh, Frankie's Royal Artillery." We'd have a chat at the bar in whispered, quiet corners. That's how it did. That was how it was in service in the 80s and 90s. You know.
I mean, like you say, especially with submariners, because you really weren't allowed to talk to anyone, were you?
No, no.
You know,
And I mean,
you've seen the programs on telly where they, you know, the nuclear subs are out and there's only 2 people know where they are in the country and stuff like that. You know,
that's it.
I can imagine that's not that far fetched.
No, it isn't. Because when I got onto the bombers, and that my job, I was a Missile Mary. So the Missile Mary was basically, we were the missile guys. So my job was to prep the missiles prior to launch. And we were always at 50, you know, when we were at sea, we were always 15 minutes notice to nuke the world. And it was, you had to go through, you know, security vetting and you know, we had to be like, you know, TS and top secret, and you had to go through all of the training about honey traps and Russian spies and all that sort of stuff, because the stuff we were dealing with the warheads and all that sort of stuff, you know. But you got on board, and then the navigator knew where we were, and the captain and the first lieutenant, and pretty much that was it, you know. And you'd have your weapons packages, and if the orders came through, it'd be like weapon package X. Weapon package X would be whatever that was, you know. But yeah, and you know, joined the nukes, and it was suddenly like, this is huge. It's, you know, amazing technology. Even though it was very archaic, because it was, you know, boats were designed in the mid '60s, but this was fantastic. You know, it was 4,000 psi air and just, you know, hydraulics at that pressure and big valves and technology, and just everything was interesting. But
more room.
Then more room. But then you went away for longer and you never surfaced. And then
I couldn't do that. I couldn't do that. I suppose you get used to it, but
well, you do, and you know, the bit that used to, I think it's like any deployment, isn't it? My lad's just been through it. My lad was supposed to be deploying to a place where obviously there's things going on at the moment in the world. So it's all been kiboshed, but he'd been prepping to deploy. So mom and dad were getting their heads around it. His girlfriend's getting his head around it, and he's getting his head around it. And suddenly, no longer deploying, it's a bit of like, you know. And you know, typical MOD, what will happen at some point? He'll be on 48 hours notice to mobilise, and he'll mobilise, and nobody's prepped for it. So there was a bit of that. You know, we're going out. Oh, it's broke. You got to go back in. And you'd have like a week of trying to fix everything, and then you go back out. That used to mess your head up. But I always took the view that once I'm gone, I'm gone. I put family out of the mind. I'm going away, focus on the job. But again, you know, some huge characters on board, and that kept it going. And you know, the routines were pretty boring at times, but you know, the Prime Minister would always keep us happy, because you go to war once or twice a week, every week, and I've done since, you know, the late '60s, and they tell you 60 seconds before, just joking, just kidding, you know what I mean? It's like just to train your muscle memory. But yeah, it was, the bombers, you know, they were an interesting sort of time. And
I mean, what was the longest you'd been underwater for on any one deployment?
We did like just under 4 months. I mean, now that doesn't feel like anything. I mean, there's if your listeners look it up, you know, I think Vanguard has just come back after 7.5 months, continuously dived. And I mean, I think that is absolutely sacrilege and morally corrupt. You cannot. How can you know, anybody?
It's like being in prison for 7.
Well, the food's worse. You've got no contact with your family.
No, that was what I was going to lead on to. That must be terrible. Because I mean, at least when we deployed, if we were away for 6 months, there'd be contact at home. You know, you just deploy like that on a patrol, and there's nothing. Nobody knows anything.
I mean, I hope, I pray to God that, you know, people aren't affected in the way that I think they might be, because it's got, you know, for some people that can mentally break you. I mean, submariners are pretty resilient in a slightly different type of resilience, because you spend a lot of time on your own, small knit communities. You can't get out. There's nowhere to go. And I think that's the thing. When I look back, if I think about it, life in the submarine service, what is all that about? Well, it teaches you very quickly that there's nowhere to hide. You're operating and living in confined environments. You've got real technical precision and teamwork, and there's absolute trust. We operate on first name terms. You don't, use rank structure. There's a huge amount of discipline and also humility in that. But what you also understand really, really quickly is it's about your own personal accountability. Because you make a mistake, it's not just hurting you, it's everybody on board that boat. Because if you're 500-600 feet underwater and shit goes south, you're already underwater, And I think it was probably the first place I really understood that connection between, technical excellence, the people, and culture. Those three things collide in that environment. And I think still today, some of the strongest leadership lessons I've learned come through that period of time in service, because, the people were just a different class at times, in whether that be taking the piss or pastoral care or, and I'm still in touch with some people now that I served with who I just hold up in big. I was a young pup, but they were chiefs, and they're all retired now. But my God, they were incredible individuals, and I learned both how to be and how not to be. And I talk to a lot of veterans about that, because I think within military service, 80-90% of us are there for the same reason. The media will always pounce on the horror stories of the 10% that aren't, but equally within that 89%, there's also, I remember looking and going, well, if I'm promoted, I want to be like that guy, not that guy. I want to speak to people like that, not like that. Do you know what I mean? But it was hard. It was hard graft. And then you come back and you start your life again. But I mean, I've still got at home somewhere. I'd have to find it. But we used to get the news, the teletype news, because what would happen is the sub would come up to periscope depth and they would mass burst comms. So you'd have a data package, and because you want to be there, up near the surface for as limited amount of time as possible and just drop down deep. So you'd literally come up and all the radio guys would be going crazy, and you're like, they'd be this mass data dive down, and then they obviously encrypt, de-encrypt it and blah, blah, blah. And, I went to sea, and Maggie Thatcher was Prime Minister. And then while we were at sea, John Major became Prime Minister, and nobody knew who John Major was. Who was this guy? Do you know what I mean? And I missed an entire World Cup. There's things like, you'd be in the car, and this still happens now. My wife goes, oh, I'm always pretty good at going, oh, that was 1986 or that was 1996 or whatever. The songs will come on and I go, I don't even remember this being in the charts, because it's come out, gone into the music charts and gone away again, and you've been at sea. You've not heard it. So, movies have come out, and it's like little segments of your life have disappeared. But on the flip side,
it must be hard when you. Sorry to interrupt you there. I said it must be hard when if there's somebody on board who you don't get on with and you're never going to get on with, because you can't avoid each other. So I suppose it forces you to.
Yeah, you can't hide. I think that is the big thing, that you cannot hide on board a boat. I think that is the really interesting thing, is that, I mean, and it does happen. But where do you go?
Exactly.
There's nowhere to go.
The toilet for 6 months, can you?
No. And like, there's literally, because you're either on you're either on shift with them, if it's somebody in your part of the boat, you're going to bump into them, crossing to the scran queue. The only mess space you had as a junior rate was the torpedo, forward up the torpedo spaces. So you'd have the torpedoes below and all the equipment above it. That's where you hung out and, did what you did. You can't avoid not watching a movie, and the only place you can watch a movie is in the mess, which is where you eat scran, and you've got a portable projector. And we used to have the old reel films, and even that was quite fun. I mean, I remember Dances with Wolves coming out, which was about 9 bloody reels of this thing. And what they would do, if you were the newbie, you'd have like a rewinder. So that you'd have the projectionist, and you've got to be like sort of, that was a pretty trusted job. So they didn't let anybody do that. That was like the film guys did that. And you'd watch the reel, and you weren't allowed to smoke while the reel was playing. But the reel would go clackety, 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 clack. And they put the lights off, everybody right, smoking. And they take it off and give it to this young kid. And he had to then rewind the movie with his crank handle to put it back in the track. And then while he was doing that, the other guys put in like reel 2 on, connecting it, and go, right, ready. Everybody put the cigarettes out, lights down, sit and watch the movie. Do you know what I mean?
You just said something there that's kind of shocked me. I never thought you'd have been able to smoke.
Oh, yeah. Everybody smoked.
I don't know why. I just thought, I mean, I
would have now, but
there was no alcohol either, was there? Or was there alcohol as well?
Oh, no, there was beer. Yeah, there was beer.
Fucking hell. I don't know why, but in my head, I thought, no smoking, no alcohol. I mean, it'd kill me doing 4 months at sea. I'd have flown out a torpedo tube to get some. I just thought you wouldn't be able to smoke.
Yeah, it was, in fact, we did a trip on one of the bombers, and we weren't planning to go out for that long. And we were basically, losing a lot of food. So we started to ration the food. And I remember going in the scran queue at about week 10 or 11. And the guy in front of me saying to the chef, who's at the serving hatch, that egg's got black spots on it. Right, this fried egg. And he got his spatula and chopped the black spots off. He went, doesn't fucking know, does it? No, eat it. And it was that sort of thing. But yeah, the biggest panic we had that whole trip was they used to have a thing called the Killick of the mess. He was like the corporal in charge of the junior acts, right? And he was nominated. So he was like the mess representative type thing.
Yeah.
So we called this meeting of all the senior leading hands and a few others. So everybody met and goes, we've got a serious issue. We've got about 3 days worth of supply of Zippo lighter fluid left. So we're not going to be able to light cigarettes. So they had this engineering meeting and ideas school to try and figure out. And this is where Matlows are just brilliant, right? Because give them a challenge with a purpose, you can't smoke unless you come up with some idea of how you can, but it can't involve a lighter. So all these ideas came forward, and these two stokers came up with this. If we get a soldering iron and we sort of short circuit it and we plug it in, it'll glow like a lightsaber, and you can light your cigarette off it, unplug it, and then pass it round. So that's what you do. There was a duty lightsaber. So there'd be 10 guys there. Somebody would plug it in, you'd spark your tab up off it, unplug it, pass the tab around. By the time it got back to you, it was half done. So you'd then light it. And the only thing we got rid of when we got back to sea, we got back to the port, we got rid of cardboard. There was a lot of cardboard left. There were cigarettes left. There was no food left. That's 2 or 3 days. We had no food whatsoever. We were on barley sugar and reserve rations and stuff. So yeah, but cigarettes and at times the doctor used to come round because we had when they do the analysing of the atmosphere, he'd have to go and tell the captain that we need to ventilate the boat, and the captain didn't like that because that means he's got to go up to periscope depth and actually put a snorkel up, suck air from the outside, and then vent it out, sort of thing. So he never liked that. So we always looked at innovative ways. And we had this doctor that he worked out that the more people were smoking, the less freon we had in the atmosphere. So we had a high freon level. He'd go, smoke more, come around telling everybody to smoke. But then on the reverse, we had a high hydrogen alarm off the battery. Because obviously you have your nuclear reactor, you have your diesels, and you have a battery backup. And we were getting these high hydrogen alarm, and we had like 3 days of no smoking. And I just remember I had a chief, Dave, and he was from Newcastle. He was just Mr. England, we used to call him, because he was a Geordie. He got like an English bulldog called Winston. He got 2 kids, James and Victoria. He was just British through and through. And we used to have these big technical screwdrivers that were about 12 inches long, and it was red insulation on the screwdriver. And they were like really precision, but you'd poke them into, lung space. And he just walked around hitting himself with that thing for about 3 days, drinking lots of coffee and just hitting himself because he was on like nicotine withdrawal. And then there was this communication broadcast, and it went to here, there, hands to pipes, everybody can smoke. And like suddenly, like everybody was just, God, get out of the way, give me the cigarettes. It was just crazy. But yeah, it was a bit of a remarkable. I mean, it's like any service, and you look back to the rose-tinted lenses. You don't look at the bloody hell. We've been in. I was in some emergency situations, and that was pretty bad. I ended up getting CASEVAC'd, and I was injured on board, and that was sort of the start of the end of my career. There was a darkness to it as well, but I do look back the older I get and go, I'm proud of who I am and what I did. And it took me 20 years to even talk about serving, and I felt great shame in the way my service ended. But I've sort of got past that now. I've come full circle, and the reason I throw myself at the veterans community and want to get the stories out there and want to help people, and I've got like a spreadsheet at the moment with about 15 people I'm helping, and each week people come off the list and new ones go on it, and I do that in my spare time because I want people to be proud of their service. I want people to transition well, and I want people to see the value of that service. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to be the storytellers for the next generation.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the reasons I do the podcast as well. That, I ask people to come on and say, I've got nothing to talk about. You'd be surprised. Everyone's got a story in them. I mean, that leads me back to, you mentioned there about, your medical discharge, and if you don't mind taking us through that. But the bit I was going to ask before that was, you said emergency times out at sea on a patrol. I mean, what's the fucking score there? What's the drill?
You stay out. Unless it's, I mean, the boats, I think every generation of boat have had real problems, but unlike a surface fleet where they can come back into shore, the boats stay out. That's why some of the best engineers I've ever come across were in the Navy, because you're not just trying to fix something for you, you're trying to fix it for everybody on that boat. The responsibility and accountability that you have as a quite junior engineer who's trying to fix a bit of kit that might be the bit of kit that is, I don't know, creating fresh water for you, or, stopping the reactor doing something that it shouldn't be doing, or, do you know what I mean? It's quite incredible, really. And we had a number of, explosions on board with air pipes going bang, and small fires and electrical faults and all sorts of bits and pieces. And the boats were very old. I mean, the Polaris boats towards the end of their commission, a bit like Vanguard are now. We haven't actually learned anything. I mean, the MOD doesn't actually bloody learn from these things, but the boats were running to the ground. and they had some technical faults. And trying to keep them going and maintain a deterrent patrol was absolutely brutal for those of us in the mid-90s. And then the big, nice, shiny things called Vanguard came out to take over. And they had a few teething problems to begin with, but, they fixed the problem. But what they've done now is they've left the Dreadnought class too late. And now you've got all the same problems, if not worse problems now with the V-boats. Hence why they're doing 7.5-month patrols, because the whole reason of having 4 boats in its class is one boat's always on patrol, which means boat number 2 is alongside the wall having routine maintenance. Boat 3 might be in, long-term maintenance, and boat 4 should be in refit. But they seem to not be able to plan and logistically sort that out. So you're extending patrols, and it's just like a car, If you put 250,000 miles on the car, then things are starting to go bang on it.
So what happens if someone dies on board?
Well, you will on triplicate. They always used to say that you body bag them and put them in a torpedo tube because it's nice and cold and it'll keep the body sort of wrapped. But I've seen, operations, we stayed dived in the vast majority. You didn't surface for that sort of thing. I remember there was a young officer woke up in excruciating pain. And because you haven't got, it's not like if you go on one of the carriers, they've got a mini hospital on board. On the boats, you don't. So the junior eights dining room, which was also where you watch the Clackety films and socialise, that became the operating theatre. And they had a mobile light. We had one doctor on board who was an officer. He was a surgeon lieutenant. The same surgeon lieutenants that were there in Nelson's day, cutting legs off with hacksaws. They are the same breed. And then there was normally a senior NCO sort of paramedic, and then there'd be a more junior medic on board. And they would do not just the ibuprofen issue or I've got it, my throat hurts or anything like that. They'd also do all the health physics monitoring. So they were into, monitoring the atmosphere, the reactors and all the radiation stuff as well. But yeah, this guy woke up in extreme pain and he'd actually twisted his testicles, which apparently is life-threatening. So they had to operate. So, there was days before Copilot and Google, he had a textbook, having never done this before, with limited anaesthetic and oxygen, and they had to put the tables together and bolt them together. And you're at sea. I mean, and they got this, I don't know if you ever had anything on me, there's this bright pink disinfectant thing called Hibby Scrub that was just horrendous, but they would scrub it down with that stuff and it had this smell about it. And yeah, they put him on the table and there was loads of guys around smoking. And they chopped him open and sort of did a bit of this and got it all sorted and sewed him back up. And yeah, we just stayed underwater.
I've got a vision in my head now, somebody playing with clackers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was interesting to say the least. Yeah, you'd have a few. One guy, I think, fell down one of the ladders and broke his arm, and they set that and stayed at sea. And yeah, it's just a different world, really. Different world.
I mean, that leads us on to why you left then, if you don't mind saying.
No, absolutely. I mean, we were about to go on patrol, and you would do like work up. So you'd have done an extended maintenance period, and then the boat goes out, and we were all like, absolutely, we're going, and we'd done a couple of weeks sort of exercises at sea and proved all the systems, and they would put these things like what they call sea riders. So these would be like, submarine squadron staff who are instructors, and they would fly out and stand there with a clipboard, and they would basically throw everything at you, fire, flood, famine, every exercise, 20 times the permutations that you're probably ever going to get in real life, and see how the ship's crew react to every situation. So they go, sort of, I don't know, cargo ship going to ram you, so you got to avoid that. And while you're doing that, you lose propulsion. So while somebody's fixing that, you lose power, so all the electrics go out. So what you're going to do with that? And the boat's going deep, so what you're going to do with that? So they're just constantly throwing things at the captain and the officers and the crew, and you go to bed and you've got about an hour's sleep and all the alarms go back off and you've got to go out and do something else. So we'd done all that. So we were sailing out on patrol. So we hadn't actually started patrol status. And then we had a small fire situation on board. And in trying to get to the where it was, I was on emergency breathing, and somebody had left a hatch that was never left open, just wasn't left open, and the compartment was dark and you couldn't see shit. And this hatch particularly, when you opened it, it had a light that appeared because for security reasons. So the people knew that the hatch was open and they'd look down and go, fine. And I fell through the hatch and between decks, ripped this bloody emergency breathing system apart. And I always say, falling wasn't the problem, it was what I hit.
Yeah.
And I just thought I was really winded, but I couldn't breathe. And they got me out and got me back to the sick bay, and my ribs were like, just all this side was just black and blue instantly. And they said, "Oh, you probably just bruised it, and don't worry about it." And we sorted it out. Everything was fine. I just felt rough as shit, and went up the fore ends, had a can of beer, and thought, I'll get a smoke and then I'll go to bed. Went to bed. I was middle bunk, so there's 3 bunks in there. They weren't very big at all. You got 18 inches between the mattress and the top of the bunk. And I just literally must have fell asleep pretty instantly. And I woke up and I could not breathe. It was like an elephant had sat on my chest and wasn't moving. And I sort of came out the bunk space, tried to stand up, couldn't. Ended up crawling on my hands and knees up this sort of ladder, fell into the missile compartment, and they all looked at me like, "What are you doing?" And I'd got a complete collapsed lung, and that was it. My ribs had snapped, and I must have leaned over, broken the ribs fully through, sliced the lung open. They tried to reinflate my, do a pneumothorax and air valve and all that, but the doctor had never done it before. He tried, couldn't do it, tried again, couldn't do it. So they casevac'd me off, and I went off to a hospital, which even then became a weird situation because they casevac'd me to a place in Glasgow, and I landed, and they got me onto the ward, and then they basically put all these tubes in me and everything, and I was dosed up on all sorts of shit. And this nurse walked in and went, "Do you speak English?" Yeah. I'm like, this is the drugs talking, And then a bit later on, this doctor came in and goes, "Do you speak English?" And I was like, what the fuck's wrong with is everybody else on drugs or is it just me? And the very same night that I'd been casevac'd, a Russian submariner had been casevac'd with appendicitis, and they'd accepted him in the same hospital, and he was the floor above me. So they thought I was Russian, and
so get you mixed up.
Yeah, exactly. So but and it took a long time, a few months to get better and right and all that. But the problem was my crew had gone to sea, and a good friend of mine who was on the other crew, because you have 2 crews for the same boat to stay, constantly on patrol. He'd been, so military police had gone to the door and banged on his door at 3 a.m, going, "You need to get your gear ready. You're going to sea now." Because he was my replacement, and again, we keep in touch on Facebook. But I felt the guilt of that because, he'd just been at sea for 3 or 4 months, and he was going straight back out for 3 or 4 months. And then when I started getting better, I went back to his crew, and of course, you were like persona non grata because you created this, situation. And so they gave me every shitty detail you could possibly think of. as a means of punishment, which fine, I can deal with that. And then they said, oh, the doctors were like, we're going to make you permanently medically unfit for submarines. I was like, well, what does that mean? Well, you're going to go back to the fleet. I said, I've never been in the fleet. And they said, well, you need to make a decision what you want to do. And the problem was there was never a situation where, and again, this comes back to why I'm so passionate, there was never that, there was nobody around, because my boat was, all the people that had investment in me were at sea. So I had nobody I could come and go, Frankie, look, what do I do? What do I do? This is my choices. What do I do? And, my wife couldn't really advise because she doesn't know what's best for me or anything. And I ended up putting my notice in. And they sent me to the weapons officer. And I said, look, I've decided I'm going to go and take the enhanced pension. So I get a slightly better pension at, I think, 60. Anyway, decided I was going to go. And he looked at me. He said, I think you're making a grave mistake. I said, well, it's the decision I've made, based upon what's been told, it's the decision I've made. And he just said to me, this, there's probably moments in your life when somebody says something and it just is ingrained in your memory. And he said, Peters, you'll never be greater than you are stood here in front of me today. And I said, with the greatest respect, sir, fuck you. I will make it my life's mission to be greater than I am here today. And that was, a week later, I did my DMOB and I went into the UPO and this guy says, here's your temporary pass, mate. Cut my mod 90 up in front of me, threw the thing in the bin. And I looked and thought, that's 10 years of my life just gone in the bin there. And I walked out to the gate and it was like, you see the prisons, they shut the gate behind you and that's it. And I just literally, we moved south from Scotland and my wife had never left home. She'd always lived in a village in Scotland. So we moved south and she was quite excited by that. But I ended up, what the hell do I do now? And I went for my first interview as a maintenance manager, stroke health and safety manager. And it was working in a factory in Birmingham. Literally, the first thing this guy said, he said, oh, see you in the Royal Navy. I said, yeah. Supposed to be impressed by that, am I? Oh, God. I was like, I didn't know how to answer that. Triggered, beyond belief. Just want to reach over and punch his lights out. But I was like, I'm not prepared for this world. I don't know this world. I don't recognize this world. And I ended up getting the job, but I lasted about 12 weeks because I just remember standing in the middle of this factory going, this is exactly the place that I tried to avoid.
Yeah.
And I've just come like a boomerang back to where the careers office woman was trying to tell me to be. And it was my wife who said, well, why don't you turn a bad situation into a good? I'd been doing health and safety. When we lost Crown immunity after the first Gulf War, I'd been on a shore-based job and they were like, can you look after the health and safety side? We've got to look after that now. And so I started getting into it. And she said, well, why don't you try and do that full time? And at the time, there wasn't many health and safety consultants and, we just got all the European legislation. So very, very naively and probably very stupidly, I wrote a letter on a computer at the library because we didn't own computers back then. And I printed a letter off 80 times and changed the address and basically just said, I'm an ex-Matlow, I'm great, gives a job. And I sent it to every health and safety consultancy in the UK. And I got about 5 replies saying, no, thank you, not got anything. And I had 3 saying, yes, we'd like to speak to you. And one of them was about 6 miles down the road. And what we'd had to do, we'd had to buy a house in England, but because my wife's a teacher, she could get a first-time buyer. So we got a little 2 up, 2 down based upon her salary. So anything else was a bit of a a sort of positive bonus. And I walked in and they said, "Oh, we've just won a contract with the MOD teaching risk assessments. Can you teach?" I went, "Oh, yes. Taught all the time in the Navy." Complete blag. I've been on my, juniors course, and, you had to do a 15-minute presentation and that type of thing. And I got home, I went to my wife, I said, I've got to do a lesson plan. They want me back on Friday to do an hour's teaching on risk assessment. I was like, what the hell do I do? So she taught me how to do a lesson plan, and I went back, nailed it. I did that for a couple of months, and then I was a young kid. I was 27. I saw it as my, I've got to get a job, and it's the submariner in you, or the veteran in you. You just want to do the great job. Now, we'll always moan about it, but your professional standards are very high. I was inquisitive and I wanted to learn. The problem was we had 5 health and safety consultants who were all in their 60s, miserable as sin, sat on the 3rd floor. And on the 2nd floor, there was all the young sales girls. There was no men. And they were petrified. They were all like 19, 20, my daughter's age. And they were petrified of going upstairs speaking to these old men, like the equivalent of me and you sort of thing now. And I was a young guy that I was like, send me anywhere. So they sent me to nursing homes and factories, and started to understand that I was a path of least resistance. So I started to get better jobs and better jobs. So I ended up working for, a couple of Grand Prix teams, Formula One teams, and worked for Jordan and Williams, and started to do bits and pieces, and got into construction. And, I thought, I quite like this construction. This is interesting. And ended up working at, a couple of power stations. And then, I sort of felt like the energy sector and HSC was going to be my path. And I took that path, purely and utterly through belligerence and resilience. And I mean, they said to me, I got put on a construction project. And again, they said to me, "Oh, have you done construction? I know you've got mechanical, electrical. Have you done sort of civil engineering?" I went, "Oh, yes. They were building this ship lift at Faz Lane, and I was around all the time, know all about it." Got the gig. I went and spent £200 in Waterstones on every civil engineering book I could find, sat in a hotel room reading, terminology and that. And I'd have going to meetings, and there'd be like a book where I wrote my notes for the day. And at the back of the book was all the idiotic questions that I then have to go back to Waterstones and buy another book to answer. But I just taught myself, And again, I think that's something from submarine service is, you just got to be resilient and crack on. And and you go 20 years down that route, and my life changed. I ended up working in 21 countries. I've run teams in 4 continents. I ended up as global HSC manager for one of the largest energy companies in the world, and they made me a board director. And I remember the day that I signed my company's house documents as a board director for this energy company, and I was talking to the company secretary, and I said, "I'm a kid from Netherton. I don't quite know how I got here, I sort of wanted to pinch myself, because I didn't come from that background where you end up working all over the world, and it was mapped out for you, and there's a blueprint, go to university, do this, do that. I just said yes to difficult opportunities. I never said no to anything, and I think that the things that you look back on, whether it would be in Plymouth and you're crawling through the mud on some assault course, or you're in Portsmouth and you're going through a submarine escape or whatever, but those demanding environments and constantly being told to learn. One thing the submarine service is really good is they put you on course after course after course with no expectation of failure. I mean, they just kept putting you on courses and you didn't even know why you were going half the time, but you were in this constant learning mode, which I've never, ejected from me. I've always been wanting to train and do reading and learning and things like that. And I think, when I look back, it's an incredible journey that I've been on in that respect. And I think it's more about the curiosity I have for the world, the resilience that the service taught me. But I'm just interested in people, because one of the other things the service taught me was that, this world is made up of amazing characters, and most of them joined the military in one way, shape, or form. And I look at my lad in his service now, and it proves to me that he is, because he's standing around. He had friends from Belize and Nepal and all sorts of parts of the world who all bring that enriched experience. It's quite weird, really, when it's that thing about you're part of the ship, part of the crew type mentality. And with submarines, you really are part of the ship and part of the crew.
I mean, that's evident. I mean, I like I said at the beginning of this, I don't really know much about submarines or the Navy, really, to be honest. But I mean, it's I was in the artillery, and on the guns, you'd end up as a crew, and your crew's on that gun all the time, and it's very similar. You work closely together, you get on each other's nerves a lot, but you do form a bond, and then you get moved on to here, and you get moved on to there, or wherever. I mean, going back a little bit, I mean, you said just now, it took you 20 years to accept leaving the service. It was the way you transitioned out of it. That bit where you said, you walked out the gate, it was like leaving prison type of thing. I mean, when I left, I handed my ID card in. We moved quarter. We moved to our house, and I had to go back and hand my quarter over, and that's when I handed my ID card in. And I had one little drive from camp, and as I drove out the gate, I just looked in the rearview mirror and thought, fuck me. That's 27 years gone. What do I mean? And, my experience of coming out, and like you said, the guy, well, you're in the Navy. The experience I have of that is that nobody gives a shit. I'd say, but I was in the army, and they'd be like, yeah, well, fucking hang on a minute. You know what I mean? I'm not saying I expect people to fall on the knees and fucking wave their arms in the air, but some kind of recognition or some kind, I think it's getting better now,
Yeah, I think it is, but it's still, there are times when I think they get it wrong. But I get what you're saying, because there is that thing about, I talk to the guys and girls a lot about this, is people believe that the uniform defines them and that is their identity. And actually it's not, but you have to go through a process to realize that, right? Because I firmly believe this, if I didn't join the military, I would have probably gone into the NHS or charity or something, some form of servitude, right? Because, and I think that's true of most people that I meet in the veteran space, we are the guys that will stop and give a quid to the homeless and have a chat with them and help an old lady across the road, or, if every time there's somebody saying something about, I mean, I've got it, my daughter's bloody, dancing in a charity. She got a small charity event, and they were asking for donations, gifts and everything. And I felt compelled to give them some money from my business. And I've ended up sponsoring the event, because it just feels like the right thing to do. And I think we're like that as our values, for all the whinging and moaning about it, and most veterans bond not because you've served in the same trench or in the same ship or the same squadron. It's because we share the same values and beliefs. We stepped up and said, yes, we'll put ourselves in harm's way. So not often consciously, we did it for different reasons, but that loss of identity is a really big thing. And I think, that image of you driving out the gates and the gate behind you and 27 years suddenly disappearing, it felt like it defined you probably in that moment. This is who you are. It's what your mission is and where you fit it in,
It's weird, but it didn't hit me until years later. Right, so I'd left. And I've spoke to quite a few people who've said the same thing. And even when I was getting counselling, we talked about that. But it doesn't hit people. So it can be like 5, 6, 7 years later, on average, really, that all of a sudden your mindset changes and you think, shit. For me, I didn't get I didn't get a leave and do or anything like that. I was just sent on gardening leave, and then all of a sudden I wasn't there. I wasn't. I understood that I wasn't needed anymore, even though I was still living on camp, watching everyone work because I was on gardening leave. But it was years later because, as I had it explained to me, was that because there was no like a leave and do or a presentation or anything like that, I didn't get none of that, so there was no finality to it. And I guess that happens to a lot of guys. There's no finality. There's no closing that door. You can't walk through the next stage of your life and close the door behind you because there wasn't one there. And you look
It's
back.
that thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
When you're in, if you're sat there, corporal, and whatever corporal you are, wherever you are, but you know who you are at that moment. And suddenly when you're no longer a corporal and the uniform's taken off you, you've got to work it out. Because now you've got to go you've got to ask yourself a deeper question. Well, who am I? And the answer the answer isn't you're a corporal. Because that's a thing. We're asking now who you are, what your values, what you're going to do to work it out again. And some people are better at doing that than others. And the problem then is compounded by the fact that oppos that you trusted, where you would go, right, tell me who Frankie is. And he'd go, well, he's an knob jockey and he's this and that, and he takes, all that banter. And then you get past that and you go, well, actually, he's a good bloke because he's my oppo. And these are your values. You ain't got that guy to ask, or that girl to ask. So you've lost your oppos, you've lost your tribe, you've took the uniform off, which you think is you when it's not you, and you haven't got anybody else to try and figure it out with. And on top of that, you lose your daily camaraderie and your banter and people who just get it. And I think that's the thing. And then I think the other thing that really rankles a lot of people is, I knew my role. I was a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. I served in the Royal Navy, in the submarine service as a weapons engineering tech, in that submarine, in that compartment, working on that shift. And I could explain to anybody who dared to ask me what my role is in the defence of the United Kingdom. You knew your mission. We all do, and all did. And suddenly, what's your mission anymore? And that's one of the reasons I couldn't work in a factory, because I didn't understand. We made containers for brains faggots. I couldn't compute what that mission was. Do you know what I mean? What does that look like? And I think the reason that I fell into the energy sector, and one of the reasons I'm a champion for the energy sector, is because I can find my mission. I can keep the lights on. I can, create a better world for future generations. It feels like a righteous mission again. And I'm not saying everybody has to have such a deep philosophy about mission, but you do need to find that purpose and mission again outside of uniform. And I think that's compounded by that question that I often get, and having started a business, I work for myself, but having started a business 18 months ago, it's that, what am I contributing today? I mean, when, my good friend Johnny Ball, who I know you've met and interviewed, and, Johnny and I are good friends, and we're big believers in that. Each day, what are you contributing to? And I think that's, you can do that through everyday life. You can do that through being very purposeful in how you lead your life and what your values are and how you pass it on to others. And I think that's also an age thing, and I found.
Yeah, I think we do change with age.
Yeah.
I definitely have. I've become a lot more mellow. Really have. A lot of people who knew me years ago wouldn't probably recognise me now. I'm not as angry As I used to be.
Oh, mate, that was me. I mean, I had complex PTSD and just completely and utterly ignored it. I was bitter and twisted about that comment when you'll never be greater than you are stood here today. I carried that weight of burden, and it felt. I always say it felt like shame, and I think the shame. It took 20 years later to have some counselling for PTSD to touch on that subject, but it was almost like because I didn't do. I never had any intention of leaving. I was going to do my full term. Because that was taken away from me almost, it felt like I'd failed. And even though I'm far more successful now, and I have had an amazing career, and I've been very fortunate and blessed in that, and I've got an amazing wife and 3 beautiful, wonderful kids, but I still carried that failure around. And I think one of the things is it destabilizes you, that the demons that you carry, and I carried it, as I said, 20 odd years. And there was a guy that, I've told this story to a couple of people now, but there's a guy called Tim Love, who is a US Marine Corps. And I was working in the US quite a bit with an energy company, and I met this guy, Tim. He's a few years older than me, but a legend of a guy. And he grew up in Detroit in the 70s in quite a rough neighborhood, shall we say, and got into quite a bit of trouble and was being helped. And one day the bus broke down outside the US Marine Corps recruiting office, and he joined the Corps. 30 odd years later, he leaves as a lieutenant colonel, and he then became a teacher for a while, and then became a health and safety manager. And that's when I met him. And he was the one poking me, going, why don't you wear a veterans t-shirt? I said, don't know. Why don't you talk about being a veteran? Everywhere, in the US, we're proud of what we do, and we've got the Veterans Affairs. And he just chipped away at me. And one of the moments that really sort of solidified, I need to change how I look at the world here, was we were sat in a place called Syracuse, New York State. It was -20, bucketing with snow, and we went out for dinner. And he'd had his nose straightened, and as you can tell, my nose is not straight. And we talked about how much that must have cost him, and he said it didn't cost me a bean. Veterans Affairs did it, and we had that chat. And he said, I keep telling you, if you wear your veterans t-shirt, you'll get treated better. Next morning, I was flying home, and I'd got to fly from Syracuse to Boston, Boston to Dublin, Dublin to home, and they put me on the standby list for my first flight, even though I've spent like £5,500 on the ticket. They put me on standby. And I was livid. And what was worse, it was like the 15th of December, and my wife's birthday is on the 17th. And the one rule that she has is you're home for the birthday, And I'm like, oh my God, I'm in so much shit here. And she said, look, if you go to the gate, plead your case. So I went to the gate, got this woman, pleaded my case, and she said, look, you're 10 on the standby list. The only way you're getting on the plane is if the other 9 people don't turn up. And I walked away, and this little thing happened where, again, very unlike me, I turned round and I said, and that's how you treat veterans. And she just flipped and was like, come back. Because it was like everybody sitting in the concourse looked at her, right, for a reaction. And she went, are you an American veteran? I said, no, I'm a British veteran. Should that fucking matter? Please, just stand there. Just stand there. And then next thing you know, this manager comes over, shook my hand. Thank you for your service, sir. Thank you for your service. What seems to be the problem? I said, the problem is I'm trying to get home for my wife's birthday. I said, I feel like I'm in a Home Alone movie because it's pissing down with snow, right? And I just need to get home. I've spent $5,500 on this ticket, and you've stuck me on standby. And I'm a veteran, and you're treating me like shit. And next thing you know, I got upgraded to first class, and I was in seat 1A. No questions asked. And I thought, well, hang on a minute, there's something in this then. And maybe you shouldn't be ashamed of your service, and maybe you should start talking about it. And literally, from that moment on, I started talking a bit more and engaging with people, and and I turned out, I've got a friend who was, well, my best friend. It was ex-signals. Did similar service to me. He was signals down at Hereford for a while, and really good lad. Never served together, but he's my brother from another mother. I've got another good friend. He was SAS Reserves, and we just, every time we meet, we just get each other, and everywhere I go, you sort of find people like Johnny Ball. I've known Johnny 4 or 5 years now, and Johnny's another one who I'm really close to, and I've got nothing but love and respect for the man. And Jim Cameron at Mission Community, and people like that. And just, you find people, but you only find those people when you recognise
you open
you're
up.
part of the tribe.
Yeah, you have to open up. I mean, I've got, my experience was the same as a few people I've spoken to as well. You thought you were fine. You thought you were all right. If life's going on. Didn't feel as though I was suffering or anything like that. But what happened to me is what I didn't realise is I became almost a recluse. I'd go to work, come home, go shopping, come home. When we first left the military, we were out once a week on a beer, me and the missus and that, stuff like that. And then all of a sudden I was like, no, I don't want to go out. I didn't want to be mixed with people. I couldn't handle it, because I didn't see it happening. It just gradually happened. And it wasn't until it was explained to me when I had my counselling that I was putting myself back in the world because I didn't like where I was. And that was probably down to, or more than likely down to, my military service. I felt as though I didn't fit in, and this imposter syndrome, let's call it. And I get called, I get called that a lot. But I mean, to me, there's different types of veterans, and the more I've been on in the last few years, been on the social media and stuff like that. There's veterans who are salty, very salty, and they will have a go at other veterans and this, that, and the other. But there's also there's a cohort of veterans who, how can I put it? Feel as though they're entitled to everything just because they're a veteran, and they're not. They really aren't. But they treat the world like that, and there's certain ones who, I wouldn't say make a living out of it, but they're not doing too bad. There's definitely guys out there who are playing on, the time that they were in the military, with not a lot to say about it, or not a lot to do for each other, or to help other people either. You do see them.
It doesn't take a lot to be humble and to show humility.
No, it doesn't. And me personally, it took me a long time to class myself as a veteran. I still now don't like that word, because I still believe it conjures up Second World War, Korea, Malaya, the old guys.
Do you know, I had, so, I mean, we talked a bit about the charity space earlier, but so I volunteer for 3 charities. So I volunteer for Mission Motorsport, Royal Marines Charity, and the White Ensign Association, which we were talking offline. And I have the pleasure now of actually working a couple of days a week for Mission, what they call Mission Community, which is a subsection of the charity. And the job is all about getting veterans into clean energy and employment pathways and all that. And we were working on a clean energy pilot, and I happened to be put in a position which I never thought I would be, but I went back to MOD main building. I went back. I'd never been at MOD main building, but in December I went to main building, and I was part of there with the CTP, Career Transition Partnership, with Forces Employment Charity, and I was representing Mission Community with James Cameron, who's was the CEO, and we ended up sitting in front of the Department of Net Zero Minister and the Office of Veterans Affairs Minister, and we're trying to talk about how do we keep the lights on, security of supply, and everything going on with Ukraine and Russia and all that sort of stuff. And how do we make it an attractive industry sector for veterans? And the one thing I said to the OVA minister was exactly your point. I said, we have to define and be better at promoting who a veteran is. Because a veteran to a lot of members of the public is the old boy with medals on. I said, but in your literature, the Ministry of Defence say if you've served one day in uniform, you're classed as a veteran. Because if you've decided to put yourself forward and you've served a day and then it wasn't for you, wasn't for them, that doesn't matter. You put yourself forward for this country. So you should deserve some recognition for that. And I said the other thing is, and something I'm very passionate about, is the 40% of people that do not complete basic training for whatever reason. High percentage medical discharges. Now, they are some of the most vulnerable young people in society. And actually, we need to turn society on to they are veterans. They haven't served long time. They haven't been deployed and they haven't done that. And it's not about one is better than the other. But we should recognise that there are different types of veteran. And, there are a lot of people serving 4 years and coming out now, very young people. And how do we, really look at that? And it's something I'm passionate about because my son was he played football at a fairly decent level and ended up semi-professional in an academy, and then it never happened for him at 18. So just before the pandemic, he got a job working for Zurich Insurance, and he had this good job with the insurance company, but then the pandemic came, and then it didn't work for him, it didn't work for them, and nobody really understood how working from home worked, and he just saw this vision of being confined to his bedroom for the next 10 years, so decided to leave and just walk. He managed to get a job working in a factory, ironically, and a friend of mine who owned a factory, and he got a labouring job, and he just walked in the door one day and said, I'm joining the Marines. I was like, of course you are. And he said, no, I'm going to join the Marines. And he did, and he went all the way through, got quite late on in training, and then got injured. And they gave him the option to medical discharge, come back in 3 years, or to chit, come back in a year. And I was in America, and he phoned me, and he said, look, Dad, I've decided to chit. And you go into protective dad mode and all the scenarios in your head. He said, look, I'm 21, I've made the decision, but I will be back in 12 months. And he literally went back and went straight through as a diamond and got put forward for King's Badge and plays football for the Marines and the Navy now, and he's having a great service. While he was in that first time round, when he came out, he didn't get his P45 for months, but he got his veterans badge pretty much almost straight away. And of course, he threw it in the drawer and said, I'm not a veteran because I didn't get my green lid. And I said to him, and one of the reasons I'm so passionate about the Royal Marines charity is because they were exceptional in how they treated him and how they kept in touch with him and helped him and supported him and kept him thinking, about being a Marine. But what they changed the view is that, yes, you weren't a Royal Marines Commando, but for over 10 months you were a Royal Marine. So whether you come back or not, you can always say that. It's not vaulting in any way because you were a Royal Marine. You just didn't pass through the 34 weeks as it is now, or 36 weeks, whatever it is. It used to be 32, but they've added 3 or 4 weeks onto it. But the point is, I think we have to change the narrative around who veterans are and what veterans stand for. And I think it's incumbent on all of us in society to recognise that. And also to encourage the others, the next generation coming through.
I mean, that is a thing, I mean, we were quite good at looking after everybody while Afghan was on. We were in the news.
Yep.
There was lots of bad things happened, but there was lots of recognition and stuff like that. And then, obviously, once the war's gone, once the conflicts are over, we were just forgot about again. I mean, you saying there about serve one day, become a veteran and all that. I mean, that doesn't sit right with me. It doesn't. But I'm old and cool. You know what I mean? And there's a lot of guys out there who would not agree with that. I see the point. I see where you're getting to, and I see what you're saying. And recently, I mean, one of the things that took me a while to do was to go to reunions and stuff like that, because I thought, that's not for me. It is for me now. That's helped me a lot. I went to a reunion last year for the guys I was in training with, and one of the guys wanted to come, but he says he can't. And you said, why can't he come? He said, if you remember, I didn't pass out a train. So what? And literally all of us said, so what? You were there at the beginning, whether you were there at the end or not. So I see where you're coming from. You know what I mean? And we said to him, you are.
Well, you look at the 40%, Frankie, and of that 40%, it's made up of those people where the military go, sorry, you're not for us. There's a percentage of people that they go, it's just not the right time for me now. There is a lot that then come back, and go and do it, go off and do things, it might be they've got boyfriend, girlfriend problems, whatever, and it's just not the right moment for them, and they do come back and serve. Or a lot of them do go in the reserves. And I think that's the other reason that we've got to make transition better for those types of people, is because a lot of these people are the reserves, and then in the new future force, the reserves are a huge part of what we're going to do for the defence of the nation. But then you've got the medical,
got the recognition they deserve.
No,
not.
And then you've also got the category of medical discharge. I mean, one of the guys that my son joined up with, this is a kid who came from social care, been care home since he was 12, and he left at like week 30 or something. Well, he hasn't even got a house to go to. I mean, that's the tragedy, and one that we have to recognise, because I think that there's a whole range of things that can get better, and that's before you even get me onto my soapbox about sexual assaults in the military. And I've dealt with a number of women that have been assaulted and have left, and and all the tragic cases around that, and that's something we have to be better at. We can't assume when people start basic training that these are all people that have been treated well in growing up and in society and have a good moral compass. We've actually got to be a responsible employer and make sure that the men and women that are serving are taught some levels of decency, as well as good soldiering and sailoring and flying. There is a responsibility on us to do that, and I think that's where the MOD have learned some very, very difficult lessons, over the last few years. But I also think that they've allowed standards to drop. I mean, every time I hear of there was a recruit having an affair with a training instructor, what is that all about? You've been in unit. There's no secrets in a unit. That people know that's going on. How is that even allowed to happen? So I think we've got to maintain the standards. We've got to make sure that we treat veterans. And I'm with you. I don't necessarily agree with a 1 day in uniform, but if that's what the MOD profess and put on their websites, then they have to stand up to that. They have to accept that. They have to do something to support that. And I think that's where there can't be hollow words. We're going to encourage the next generations, because unfortunately you and I are going to be a bit too frail to do anything if it all goes south. Do you know what I mean? Although you've got a better starting point than me, what's on your wall. But, we've got to be better at this. And I think the MOD has a responsibility to do that, because
it'll be interesting to see what, the new Office of Veterans Affairs and the new ops that are coming out of, actually do.
Opval and all of that.
Opval. I couldn't remember the name then. Thanks for reminding me.
White Ensign Association.
Yes.
Yes.
The reason I wanted to bring that on now is that it leads on from just literally what we just said, where we've got to get better. Now, there's lots and lots of charities out there, and before we started recording, I spoke about the project I'm involved in at the moment, and there's a lot of people who don't like the bigger charities because they don't trust them. And then you mentioned the White Ensign. I'd never heard of these before. Never heard of them. And from what you said of it, it sounds like they could almost be a role model for other charities, if you know what I mean. Do you want to explain a bit about the White Ensign? The guys won't know where it is.
No. I mean, the White Ensign Association, it's been going for a long time, but it always doesn't seem to get the recognition it deserves. But it's designed for the naval families, whether you're Royal Fleet Auxiliary or Marines or Navy. It was set up post World War II by somebody who set up NCP car parks and was set up a charity for the benefit of naval families and everything else. And what I like, they've got some really, really good people there, and they are very proactive, talking about pensions and beneficiary support and things like that. And they are really good. And they have offices on HMS Belfast, which is Gucci, and that's pretty cool. But they've got a range of people, and like some of the pensions guys there are just ex-marines, really good people. They go around all the naval bases talking about transition and giving pension advice, and they help with employment pathways, and they've got like an employment education team down there. And yeah, I mean, I just find them really good people and just genuinely want to do the right thing. I'm not saying that other charities that isn't the case, but I think a lot of the charity space, my criticism of it is that what tends to happen is you and I have a charity, and then we have a bit of a fallout. So I start another charity to do the thing that you didn't agree with, and you end up with 300 odd military charities for that reason. And then what also happens is when one of the charities isn't doing so well, they try and then step on the toes of a charity that is doing very well in a different space. And, that also can be an issue. But I think whether the charity works for you is often down to the personality of the people in there. And I think if it fits with your sort of view of the world, and that's why I like, WEA are fantastic. They've got some amazing people. And they just seem to be slightly less bureaucratic than others, and I think a lot of people get a lot of help because of that.
I mean, the other thing is you can't please everybody. You can't please everybody all the time, And
some of the larger ones are quite bureaucratic, and also I think some of the, I know there was a big controversy with the Royal British Legion, when they employed a very highly paid diversity, equity and inclusion. And I'm not saying that DEI isn't a thing, but a lot of veterans went, why are you spending charitable money on that? Do you know what I mean? So I think the messaging of the charities can be better.
Most definitely.
But yeah, I mean, I think WA is really good. I look at Mission Motorsport, and I was at Racer Remembrance last year, which, if you don't know, basically Mission Motorsport was set up to be, race, recovery, train is what its sort of motto is. And it was set up for broken boys and girls to use motorsport as a recovery sport, and became very, very successful over the last 14 years. They do beneficiary races where we get lots of different cars that will take veterans around on the track and just put a smile on the face. And what's not to like for that? I've been at events where you've had everything from Chelsea pensioners to Blesma and everything in between. They get a lot of cadets involved and get them interested in motorsport and engineering. But what they do is, on Remembrance Weekend, there's a recognition that not all the men and women want to do a traditional cenotaph style remembrance service. So what they do is they do a race on Anglesey, and it's an endurance race, and it's a bit British and bonkers because they do a lot of sort of prep for the race on the Friday with some qualifying heats and all of that, and on the Saturday morning, and then they have Supercar Saturday where they get all these fancy cars and they take the veterans around the track, And we have everything from like Army motorsport, Navy motorsport, Air Force, loads of people. Like we had Chris Harris from Top Gear arrive, and we had the current touring car champion who was driving as well that weekend. But then they stop and they have this thing called the Biathlon of Foolishness, which is where everybody dresses up in fancy dress. There's a very British thing, and then runs over, jumps in the Irish Sea, and then run back, get changed, and to race in overalls. And everybody goes racing on endurance. So they race all day Saturday till 10 o'clock at night. Sunday morning, everybody races again. But at 10:30, all the cars come into the pit lane, and everybody combs their hair, puts their berries on, puts their jackets on, puts their medals on. You do a very quick remembrance service with RAF Valley and all the local community. And then there's this moment where, after the last poster's gone into the distance and everything, somebody jumps on stage and goes, "Let's go racing," and the race starts again in the same order that it just finished. And it's a bit like, if you ever remember the Cannonball Run, right at the end there's a fight scene and somebody said the road is open and all these racing car drivers run off. It's a bit like that. But the smiles on people's faces, and they have occupational therapists there, and it's just humbling to be around that community of people that just want to remember in a different way. And the amount of hugs that I got that weekend, I had bruises from just people just randomly just hugging you and just being part of that community. And I think that's where charities are fantastic and can be fantastic, because for that moment, some broken people aren't as broken, and some people who might not feel worthy feel worthy, and it's on all of us to point them in the right direction. But it's got to be right for you. Not everybody will be in the mold of that charity works for me. But
no, they won't, and it is finding it. Like it's almost like you find your tribe again, type of thing.
Totally,
very much like that. I know a lot of veterans who are into the biking, facilities, and that's them coming out of one tribe going into another. Whether you want to go off and do that or what, it's up to you. I mean, we've been on for 2 hours now. I bet you weren't expecting that, were you?
No, not at all. Not at all.
I mean, if you want to give us a quick plans for your future before we leave, and recommendations for anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think talk is the main thing. It's okay to talk. It's okay not to be okay. Find your tribe, but you don't find your tribe if you don't speak to people. And don't think the first person you speak to will be the answer, but they might know somebody who passes you on to somebody who passes you on to somebody. And I mean, I sat at Silverstone this year at the National Transition event as part of the planning team, and I just sat back and looked across the room, and there was like, Tank Regiment and Mercenary Regiment. I was sat next to a 1-star general, or retired, and I'm like, how am I in this room? Obviously, I was the only member of the senior service, so they all had to stand up when I left. But but I'm there because I started to speak to people. I started to connect, and I think I can't encourage it more. Just listen to podcasts like this, and go and find some encouragement from others. And I mean, people can find me on LinkedIn and drop me a message anytime, and I'll always post them in the direction. But just find your tribe, because we're better together. And as individuals, we can often tell ourselves a narrative that we're not worthy, and yet actually we are, because ultimately when you find your tribe, I think many veterans don't miss the uniform as much as they miss what it represented. The things we talked about, like identity and belonging, standards, purpose, all those things. And I think when you suddenly find your tribe, you get a bit of that back, and you realise it wasn't the uniform, it was who you are. And I think that's the good thing.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Totally agree.
And even now I'm mid-50s, I'm still finding things. I left corporate, and again I think this is age thing, but I was put in a situation 18 months ago where I didn't particularly agree with the direction and thought, right, I'll take some money and leave and figure out what I'm going to do with my life. I actually went through a second transition because then all the things I've just said to you happened again to me because I'd been in a corporate environment for 20 years in very large organizations with very large teams, and I was a director and all that sort of ego stuff. And suddenly it's like, what am I? I'm a house husband for 3 months. I was on garden leave and I learned to cook and walk the dogs more and fixed everything in the house that needed fixing. But then I'm like, I've got to do something. But who wants to employ a kid from Netherton who might know a few bits about the energy sector? And so I started my own business. That was terrifying.
Yeah,
I had no idea about websites and technology. And I'm not an IT guy like you, and I troglodyte when it comes to some of this stuff. But, I did it. And I did it out because I went and spoke to people and said, do you know somebody who can build me a website? Or I need a logo.
Yeah.
And somebody went, well, actually, do you remember that kid who used to be in your football team, Joel? His girlfriend is from Kent, but she's living up in the village and she's a graphic designer and she's out of work. Really? Next thing you know, she's designed my logo. And then I connect her to the website lady who then they have a conversation and they don't talk. And you've just got to build your tribe. If your tribe's not there, build it. That's
Which
what
is
I
what
do.
we're trying to do with that thing I'm working on.
Totally.
I'm going to have to stop you there because we're 2 hours, 5 minutes, and that's quite a long time. And I really don't want to take up too much of your time tonight.
It's all good.
Again, thank you for coming on. I really enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
Opened my eyes about submarines. I still can't believe you could smoke on a submarine. I don't know why. I really don't know why that I thought that wouldn't happen. But I mean, again, it was different times.
Different times.
Yeah, I don't think
Just
you
don't
can
ever watch
camps.
Crimson Tide with Gene Hackman and think you can take a dog on board. I've never seen a dog on board a submarine. So
The only thing that made me, I mean, all right, I'm saying we're going to leave now, but we've just started again.
yeah.
There was a drama on last year, or the year before, where there was a murder on a submarine.
Oh, yeah.
And I was watching that and I was thinking, them submarines must be fucking massive. And I'm just looking at thinking, what a load of shit this is.
Absolutely.
Thinking, yeah,
The
you could
phone,
drive a car down that corridor.
I think the night that the first episode came, my phone lit up with Facebook notifications of just grumpy old Matlows going, no, never, But yeah.
I mean, even as an old squaddy, I thought, what's a load of shit.
It's BBC though. You know what I mean?
Yeah, true.
Big
right,
budget.
I'm going to say, again, thanks for coming on, mate.
No,
really
thank you very
enjoyed it.
much indeed. And I wish everything the best for you with what you're doing. You're doing a great thing. And I think the podcast's fantastic. And as I said,
Thank you very much.
Let's
Right,
keep in
I'll
touch.
stop the recording there.
All right.
I hope you enjoyed that podcast. I enjoyed recording it. If you could just hit the like button, and also if you could subscribe and hit the notification bell, that'd be great, because it'll help the channel grow. The more people will see it, the bigger it'll get, and the more guests I can get on, and the more people I can talk to. Well, I hope you enjoyed it, like I said. Look forward to the next one. Hopefully we'll be out next week as normal. Bye-bye now.